So now we're going to look at the difference between civil rights and civil liberties. These are two different ideas. We're going to start with civil rights. And you just look at this picture in the bottom left-hand corner, and you look at these guys' faces, and it makes me think, wow, look at the determination and the unity for civil rights. And I'll never forget that picture in the bottom right of the police dogs that are attacking the man for protesting. You can see even his hands are open. He's not doing anything threatening, just being attacked. Now, civil rights concern the basic right to be free from unequal treatment based on certain protected characteristics. So, race, gender, disability, in settings such as employment, education, housing, and access to public facilities. Okay. So, those are civil rights issues. So, being treated equal at school is a civil rights issue. Being treated equal at work is a civil rights issue, regardless of your sex, your race, your gender, your creed, or if you're disabled, which is a group that is very small but also very mistreated. There's a lot of cities in the United States and places where, people that are disabled do not have access to certain buildings. That's discriminatory. And they're not hired. That's discriminatory. Those are civil rights issues. When we think of civil rights, I think a lot of times we think of the modern civil rights movement, and we think about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks and all these big names. However, it's more than just for equity between the races or people's skin color or their ancestry, but also it's their gender, their sex, how they identify, the LGBTQ plus community we'll talk about. So let's look at some data here. This is really interesting. Since 1946, and people think, oh, the world has gotten more violent. There's less civil rights. There's less incidences of violence. Actually, violence has decreased, especially since World War II. And really, after the 1970s, it's kind of bumped, and then it's been going down, and trending down. And I'm looking at this data, and there is an argument made by some historians and social scientists that violence overall is going down, and it may have something to do with the fact that we have learned through nonviolent means how to accomplish things like civil rights or to prevent wars. And you could give maybe credit to Mohandas Gandhi. Remember, that was 1949 when India, Gandhi was assassinated. India finally got their freedom, and you can see that big bump, and it just drops off after the late 49. And then there's the 60s, you see Martin Luther King, the Vietnam War, and you can see that these techniques of nonviolence have kind of come across the world. They've been used in South Africa. They've been used in the Middle East, in the Arab Spring. So civil rights have been accomplished through nonviolent means, and maybe it's had a positive impact. That's one perspective. Now let's look at civil liberties. Civil liberties are concerns basic rights and freedoms that are guaranteed either explicitly, which means if it's explicit, it has to be written down, identified in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution, or interpreted or inferred through the years legislators of the court. So if it's inferred, that means that it's seen as in the Constitution. Okay, it's actually in the Constitution, or it's seen to be there. The words are interpreted that way. So here are some of your civil liberties. You have the right to freedom of speech. We've talked about the 5 pieces of the First Amendment. You got freedom of speech, freedom of protest, freedom of petition, freedom of religion, and freedom of press. Those are the 5 freedoms. Those are all civil liberties. They're actually in the First Amendment. Right to privacy. Now, this is a good one. It's a civil liberty. Even though it doesn't explicitly say right to privacy in the Bill of Rights, the Supreme Court has interpreted, especially in the Fourth Amendment, that you have a right to privacy. You can't be searched without a warrant. Your car can't be searched, or your house can't be searched without a warrant or some kind of probable cause. There's got to be a cause behind it. And we did talk about one exception is under the Patriot Act in times of war. If you're suspected of terrorism, that somehow this civil liberty is disregarded by a law. And the Supreme Court said in times of war that can happen. The right to remain silent in a police interrogation. That's very important. I think most attorneys are going to tell you, even if you're 100% innocent, you haven't done anything wrong, you probably don't want to say anything if you're being accused of doing a crime to the police without a lawyer present, so that they can advise you and give you good information on when to say and when. They're not going to tell you to answer the questions, but you want somebody there that knows what they're talking about. The right to be free from unreasonable search of your home. We talked about that. You need a warrant. The police can't just kick your door in and come in or invade your house without a warrant, which means that the executive branch, the police, have been checked by the judicial branch. The judge, some kind of judge, is signed off on a court order warrant. The right to a fair court trial. This is very important. Your due process, the process that you're due when you're charged. If you're accused of something, it could be wrongfully or it could be rightfully, you still have a process. You're innocent until proven guilty. You have habeas corpus. They bring your body to court and they tell you what you're being charged with. The judge says, blah, blah, blah. You've done this and that. And then you can prepare for your trial to prove your innocence. A right to marry is a civil liberty now. You think about, we're going to talk about a famous case called Oberfeld versus Hodges, which said that gay marriage is protected under the 14th Amendment. So if it's in the 14th Amendment or in the Bill of Rights and it's considered to be there, then it is a civil liberty. And then the right to vote is a civil liberty. You have a right to vote, and that is protected under the Constitution, and that's seen as a civil liberty. Now, just a reminder, we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, this outlawed gender and religious segregation in schools, public places, and guaranteed equal employment. So this is a really good way to remember if it's a civil right or a civil liberty. If it's a civil right, under the Act of 1964, that's the law you would use to protect yourself or protect somebody. So if you're mistreated based on your race, your gender, or your religion in schools or public places or under any kind of employer, you could bring up a civil rights issues. Prisoners have a lot of civil rights issues. They feel like they're being mistreated or their rights are being violated in the prison system. Just because you're a prisoner doesn't mean you don't have rights. You still have some rights as a citizen of the United States. You lose some rights because you're in prison, but you do not lose all your rights as a human being. So that's really important. And you can see there's Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson, signing the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Martin Luther King smiling over his shoulder. It's a very famous picture. And actually, Johnson at the time said, this is basically the end of my career. I mean, he's really considered that. If there was ever, the filibuster was really, it rose to power to fight civil rights legislation. A lot of people don't know that, but the filibuster, trying to talk bills to death, Civil Rights Act of is where it really came into filibustering, and the Republican senators really worked hard to stop civil rights legislation. But in the end, it failed. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. This filibuster went on for, I believe, almost days. Now, this is an important case called the Heart of Atlanta Motel, Inc. versus the United States. Very important case. So basically what happened is this hotel owner, and this has been the civil rights argument up until 1964, argued that in Atlanta, he does not have to serve black customers. So he doesn't have to have African Americans stay in his hotel. Well, under the Civil Rights Act, this is really interesting how they won this case. They argued that this is a Commerce Clause issue. This is really brilliant what they did. So what happened is the Commerce Clause of the Constitution says that the legislative branch, Congress, has the right to regulate interstate trade and buying between states commerce, okay? And under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is a law, very important law today, that is a state law as well, that you can't violate somebody's civil rights under the Commerce Clause. So the hotel was sued and said that it had to host travelers from outside because it hosted travelers from outside the state, they couldn't discriminate against someone of color. So under the Commerce Clause, Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, several states, and the Indian tribes. So under the Commerce Clause, they argued that the Civil Rights Act was applicable and applied to all hotels in America because commerce between where people stay between states could be regulated by the legislative branch. So therefore, the laws, both the Commerce Clause and the Civil Rights Act, were applicable to this hotel, and they won because the argument up until the Heart of Atlanta Motel Inc. versus the United States was that if I own a restaurant or a bar, that is my business, and I can choose who comes in and out. Well, because you're going to have patrons or people that are coming from other states to go to your bar, or restaurant, or hotel, the Commerce Clause applies, and that's actually how the Heart of Atlanta Motel Inc. case won civil rights and applied it across America to businesses. Now, when we go back to the Civil Rights Act, one group we did not mention was LGBTQ+. That's why, unfortunately, you will still see discrimination against the LGBTQ+ community. So there were people in Arizona, for example, that they would have signs outside that we don't serve, LGBTQ, or we don't serve lesbians or gay people. That has not been resolved as discriminatory. That's up in the courts right now. We may see that change, that would be covered under the Commerce Clause. But again, under Civil Rights Act, it says gender and it says race, but it doesn't say sexual orientation. So that is soon to be seen. All right. Now, the legal doctrine of incorporation, we'll go over this again, states that the restrictions and demands placed on federal government by the Bill of Rights applies this selectively to the states as well, under the 14th Amendment. So just be clear. They'll call it the Incorporation Doctrine too. So the right to get married is incorporated by the 14th Amendment into state laws. So it's equal protection under the law under the 14th Amendment. So that means that you cannot discriminate because of Obergefell versus Hodges and the 14th Amendment in Arizona against gay marriage, because it's automatically incorporated because it is a civil liberty. Now, real quick, we're going to talk about the full faith and credit clause, and we'll be clear on this idea again that the full faith and credit clause also addresses the duties of the United States what the United States has to respect the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. That's why it's really important that the full faith and credit clause and the civil liberties under the Incorporation Doctrine are all honored in all states. So full faith and credit clause says you have to honor this idea of equal marriage regardless of their sex. If they can get married in New York and you have gay marriage, then they have to honor it in other states. That's the way it would go under the full faith and credit clause. But what now supersedes that is because of Obergefell versus Hodges, under the 14th Amendment, it is an actual civil liberty to get married for gay marriage. So now it has to be incorporated, if that makes sense. But before, because of the full faith and credit clause, before 2015, Obergefell versus Hodges, if somebody got married in New York where gay marriage was allowed, they had to honor their marriage license in Kentucky if they moved to Kentucky. Because of the full faith and credit clause, your licenses, your marriages from New York, your driver's license, all that stuff has to be honored in other states. That's important. But now this case has been incorporated to all the states now.